Calbraun the Unbreakable, A Tome of Light Story, J.P. Halden Wang. Dream of me. Think of me. Chapter 1. Do you see it? Calbraun whispered to his son. Halus peered through the trees, slowly and softly. Calbraun taught him that even the slightest sound could scare the deer off. Even Calbraun could hardly see the animal. It was about 100 feet away, its head down eating an evergreen plant. Any closer and they may have been seen or even heard with the twigs that covered the ground. Calbraun looked to his son and saw his eyes darting in every direction. He still doesn't see it, the old elf knew. Halus's eyes lit up for just a moment, just enough to let his father know that he spotted it. The boy slowly went to one knee, his hand creeping up to his shoulder where the arrows peeked out from the quiver on his back. The projectile slid quietly with the hint of a hiss as the boy raised it to get it out of the quiver. The rattle of wood from the arrow escaping the quiver and sliding against the other arrows was drowned out by the whirling of the wind picking up. The young elf knocked. Halus tensed up, looking to see if he spooked the deer. Its head shot up, looking to them in a frozen stance. Its mouth moved back and forth from chewing its food. The old elf gently knelt behind his son, his head only a few inches from Halus's ear. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. The boy was shaking slightly. The anxiety was getting to him. Calbraun had hundreds of years of experience stalking deer. Hunting the creatures was as normal as the rising sun, so he paid them little heed anymore. To his son, it must have been an exciting sight. The game between man and beast was something fresh to him, knowing that if he didn't loose the projectile perfectly, they wouldn't have a kill. They had already killed 3 deer earlier in the day. Calbraun naturally got the first, then his oldest son Clorin got the second, then Hecarus, his middle son, the third. This kill was his youngest son's. Clorin was skilled enough, but lately he knew it was time that all of his children learned how to hunt and fend for themselves if that time ever came. How could a boy learn how to take care of himself if I kill everything for him? Exhale on release, Calbraun whispered. He could hear the boy's breaths and they were loud and constant. Ease yourself, aim for the heart, loose when your mind is clear, see the arrow going into the deer, be the projectile. The youngling was still hesitant. He wasn't as experienced as Calbraun's oldest son, Clorin, nor had he the natural accuracy of Hecarus. He's still my son, the old elf reminded himself. There is both a warrior and a hunter inside of him. He heard Halus's breathing slow down. The breaths came in through his nose and out of his mouth. He was concentrating. Twang! The arrow took off, between the trees that stood between them and the deer. A quick packing sound came and the deer ran off. Halus shot up from his knees and looked for the animal, but it was gone. Did I miss? Halus asked in worry. Calbraun rose, a smile across his face and already knowing the answer. He found himself exhaling the word, no. When his youngest son looked at him, Calbraun removed the smirk and put his stone-like expression back on. If he sees my admiration, he may get arrogant and not want to better himself. It was an impressive volley. The young elf practiced many times on trees, hay, and even fake targets, but Calbraun was well aware that a life within a target changed the way a boy would handle a bow. It ran off, Halus noticed. Deer often do that when they are struck with an arrow, Calbraun said. So what do we do? The boy asked. We track him. Calbraun walked forward, hearing his son only a step or so behind. The boy's steps were anxious, even a little excited. The old elf had killed hundreds of deer, possibly thousands. Knowing his son was thrilled with this hunt brought him back to his own childhood for just a moment. One of the only pleasant memories he had when he remembered times with his own father. Calbraun kept his hand on the hilt of his sword as he stalked through the trails. Halus's hit was true. The deep packing sound it made after his son's launch confirmed it to his ears. He could vaguely hear the boy in back of him, silently following his father through the brush. The old elf took his time because others could have been out there. Outlaws, thieves, murderers, and only the 6 gods knew what else could have been awaiting them. The leather brigandine he used while going out on a hunt couldn't handle a strong enough arrow if it was aimed with purpose, so he needed to keep his eyes and ears open in the event another hunter was out there. He found light armor to be the best while hunting, allowing him his maneuverability. An animal attack in heavy armor could slow him down and he needed to be fast in the wilderness. Calbraun walked to where the deer stood when his son loosed his arrow, noticing the trail of blood leading deep into the thick forest. He pushed his way through thorn bushes, pulling them aside so he didn't get scratched. He heard Halus groan every so often. He would have warned the boy about the thorns, but feeling the scrapes of them would be a better lesson than words. There was a horrid sound in the distance. An unnatural cry called out with each exhale of breath. Calbraun no longer needed to track the deer by the trail of blood. All he needed to do was follow the screeching. There were ruins ahead of him. Coarse stones that had no reason to be in the forest lay in rubble. It must have been a prayer altar for the goddess Talius in previous years, since she was said to be the reason for beauty and love. The earlier clans worshipped the forests and all that dwelled in it, praising her for the gifts of nature and nourishment. When he came around a small stone wall, he saw the reason for the animal's cries. When the deer was running away, one of its legs went into a soft patch of dirt and snapped. It was lying on the ground, arrow through its side and bleeding out. Calbraun by instinct went for the dagger to his waist but stopped himself. When he glanced over at his son, Halus had a face that was far too mature for an elf boy of 10. He was looking at death for the first time. He was more in shock than anything else. A face of sorrow and regret quickly came over the child. "Halus," Calbraun called. The boy was frozen in disbelief. "Halus." The second call gained his attention and the boy jolted for a split moment, as if coming out of a trance. Calbraun then held out his dagger to his son. "Finish it." "But father—" "Do it or the deer will suffer," Calbraun said, as if that will ease his mind. He must have figured the arrow would kill it instantly, not knowing we'd have to track it. Calbraun never saw a sight such as this if he needed to be honest. He would always track a deer until he found it. It's better this way. He will see the harsh realities of the hunt. Today it will be a deer he kills. Years from now, the life of another being, perhaps one that is the same age as he is now, some boy who will grow up to be a victim. Or perhaps he would be the victim. It was his duty to make sure Halus wouldn't be, and this was the first step. Killing a deer was nothing. It was an animal. Its only concern was eating. It couldn't compromise. It couldn't think beyond its survival. It couldn't lie or deceive them. It was easy prey, much like his youngest son. The boy held the dagger in his grasp, gripping it as if the tighter he went, the deer would die without him having to cut it. A slight shake took over him. Halus came out of his trance, raising the deer's head and putting the sharpened lichen dagger to its throat. He ran it across the deer's throat, struggling somewhat, not knowing how much pressure was needed. But the task was done. The cries from the animal went silent. There was nothing but a curdling groan now. Its movement was in shudders as its limbs trembled. Halus rose, blood-soaked dagger in his grasp and some of it spilling onto his hand. The boy inspected it, rubbing his fingers together. Calbraun walked over and took the dagger from him. The deer crying like that could be heard for miles. If there are others in the area, they will come running. It puts us in danger. We have to take our kill and leave right now. Halus took a few steps toward the deer. His face was pale now. He let his hands go, dropped to his knees, and with a whisper said to his father, "It wasn't right." Calbraun's head came up wide-eyed. "What wasn't?" "Killing it." "Why would you say that?" Calbraun grabbed the deer, lifting it up and placing it over his shoulders. He stepped gingerly toward his son so he wouldn't trip on some branches. He stood in front of the young boy now. It was only recently that Calbraun started taking him on hunts, but this was the first time he participated. With Clorin being so much older than the other two boys, Calbraun could usually go alone while his eldest son watched Hecarus and Halus. As of late, the two younger boys were about to reach an age in which all boys learned the ways of hunting and warfare. Hunting was the easier to learn. Mortal versus beast is much easier to teach. Halus had yet to answer his father. He was still dismayed by what he had to do. Calbraun for a moment dropped the deer in front of his own feet and kneeled down to his son. "Sometimes taking a life is necessary. There are two major reasons you can take life. One of them is hunting. We need this deer to survive and live. We can't very well stuff ourselves on berries. There is a balance in this world. We are elves, they are beasts. Animals hunt one another for food, and many of them will one day hunt you, like the Magnus bears or the Gigas wolves that are spread over every portion of this continent. When it is us against animal, it is never for reason, for land, for a king, or for title. It's for who will end up being whose meal. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't like to be in the belly of any beast. Now, the other reason to kill, the one you will see more than any other in this world, is protecting your land, your people, and those you love. There are mortals and other evil beings in this world that will try to take what you have. Taking what doesn't belong to you is easier because you don't have to work for it. It is your duty to protect it. Killing is something that must be done. It is up to you to decide if it is justified or not, and you will know in your heart if the reason is right. Others will kill you for far different reasons. Power, greed, or just because they feel like it. The world we live in is not a pleasant place. Warriors of honor die more than those who use treachery and deceit. So you see, boy, I'm not just teaching you how to hunt deer. I'm teaching you how to survive." The boy's eyes were still so innocent. He didn't seem to want to believe what his father told him. Calbraun just grabbed the deer once more, hoisted it over his shoulders and motioned for Halus to follow him. Halus's steps were soft and slow now. The boy even walked sad, he noticed. He will learn when the time is right. They came from the thick forest, out into the open road where Clorin and Hecarus awaited them. Clorin had an arrow ready and aimed at his father before he realized it was him. When he recognized them, he lowered his bow and couldn't help but smile at the sight of another catch. "Did you get that one?" Clorin asked his father. Calbraun shook his head. "No, Halus did. First arrow too." Clorin tousled Halus's hair in congratulations. "Good job, little brother." Clorin seemed to notice his half-brother's dejection. "What's wrong?" "He had to cut the deer's throat," Calbraun answered for him. "Really?" Hecarus asked, a surprised expression coming over his girlish facial features. Calbraun dropped the fourth deer on the small wooden cart with the other 3 kills. He also used a bucket where Calbraun put the innards of the first 2 kills, but he noticed Clorin opened the 3rd deer and let the entrails spill on the ground. "What did you do that for?" "I made a mistake," Clorin said with submissive eyes. "We didn't use the insides in the sanctuary. I forgot that you do. You're not in the temples anymore. We could have used that," Calbraun snapped, pointing to the ground. "There are more important parts to a deer than its flesh and fur." "I was going to do that, but I forgot to get the bucket," Clorin said in sincerity. "Because you lack patience," Calbraun snapped. "You rush through things without thinking." "It's just skinning a deer, father," Clorin reminded. "You're stupid if you think I'm just talking about skinning a deer." Calbraun exhaled in frustration. "Of course," Clorin said. If Calbraun needed to be honest with himself, he would admit that sometimes he could be harsh on his sons. Then in the next breath, he would say it wasn't his fault. An old warrior such as himself had seen many things. War, battles, the deaths of enemies as well as loved ones. It had hardened him in many ways, yet it made him more bitter than most. Many who encountered him thought of him as a hollow man, but their perception was far from the truth. The reasoning behind his muted emotions was for all the loss he had suffered throughout the years, the worst of them, the death of both his wives. The loss was reminded every time he looked at his sons. Calbraun had seen his own reflection in rivers and mirrors throughout his life. Sometimes when he looked at Clorin, he thought he was looking at himself when he was younger. His eldest son carried many of his features, including his facial expressions and even in the way the two of them walked. His first wife's mannerisms came every so often, mostly when the boy was disappointed or angry. Alsa, his first wife, was a warrior much like him, fierce and brave, yet she was beautiful and enchanting all at the same time. He feared his first wife. She had a brutality about her when it came to war and killing their clan's enemies. He often wondered if he was even worthy of her. If any of her characteristics went to Clorin, he hoped that eventually it would be his skills in battle. The path of the warrior was not one Calbraun chose for his first son. For most of his younger years, he was in a sanctuary so his life wouldn't be put in danger. By the time his second wife had passed, Clorin's life was in danger because of a new enemy, and his training started once more. Alsa may not have liked what Calbraun did with their son in his early years of life, but his life was safer without being surrounded by war and death in the wars between the clans. Clorin wore the same type of leather brigandine as his father, with a leather belt around his waist and the sword Calbraun had crafted for him when he started his training several years earlier. A lichen blade was a hacking weapon, used more so like an axe, leaving nasty wounds as opposed to the cleaner holes created by spears or long blades. It was a thick, curved iron sword. It was forged from a combination of metals and onyx, giving it a darkened appearance. Because of its razor-sharp edges, it could hack off limbs and decapitate a head with a single blow. The boy was exceptional with the weapon. The training sunk into his mind, and he gradually became a gifted swordsman. He wasn't yet a master, but he still had years to gain more knowledge. When Calbraun was his age, he had seen enough bloodshed to cover several lifetimes, but he protected Clorin from having to kill and didn't want to raise the boy as he was. Because of the lack of war, Calbraun would still spar with him when he could, trying to hone and polish the boy's skill to be as sharp as the blade he wielded. Hecarus was only a year older than Halus, a rarity among their race. It was known that elf females could only conceive every few years, and yet Calbraun and his second wife had 2 children only a year apart from one another. From a distance you would think Hecarus and Halus were twins, considering the same height, same skinny build, and the fact that both of them had golden blonde, shoulder-length hair. It was only when you got up close that you saw the differences in their faces. Hecarus was blessed with his mother's looks, but almost too much. While growing up, many mistook him for a girl. When Calbraun corrected them, it was met with the comment of, "He is far too girly-looking to be a boy." Hecarus would lash out when he was mistaken for a girl, often yelling at those who said it or even becoming forceful. Calbraun suspected that the young boy would one day use his anger to his advantage once he was old enough to train. A male warrior was to be rugged and stone-faced. He would be underestimated in his life because of his looks, and if Calbraun trained him properly, he could use his enemy's underestimation of him as an advantage. Halus, or little brother as Hecarus and Clorin called him, was a quiet boy. He was very reserved and would only become vocal when spoken to. A shy child would have to fight harder than most. This would be his curse in life. Much like Clorin, Halus looked like his father. He seemed to always have his head down, looking to the ground as he walked and never having a strong posture. Like most children, he would play, run around and cause trouble whenever the time suited him. But he was often an outcast by the other children because of his demeanor. It seemed they picked up on his timid nature and exploited it. Calbraun often found him to be a gazelle among the lions when he was in any situation outside of those he was comfortable with. Halus had a gentle heart, the most important quality passed on by his mother. Like the sight of him having sympathy for the deer, Calbraun knew it wouldn't take a long time to try and change that in the boy. The world was no place for soft mortals, and others would take advantage of that weakness. The walk back to their village would take several hours. If Calbraun pushed the boys, they could make it there just before sunset. He ordered Clorin to push the cart of deer, while Calbraun stayed in front of him with an arrow nocked and the string of his bow at the ready in preparation for anyone they may encounter. In times such as this, even those who would be considered honorable would thieve in order to gain a good meal. Rumors were spreading far and wide about what was going on in the northern territory of the Winterlands. A war was being waged. The elven tribes were all going to war with one another, and there was nothing but blood and death just beyond the borders of Cavell. Word would come in every so often from travelers coming through the village. The people of Calbraun's village would gather around the traveler as if he were some kind of deity and listen to the stories of what he had supposedly seen or heard about from the north. The tales kept changing. Each new version swelled like the stomach of an ogre. Calbraun chose to only believe half of what he heard and prayed that the battles and the war would stay to the north. In recent weeks, travelers claimed the battles were getting closer. Tribes that had been nearly destroyed were said to be moving away from the conflict, and that meant they could come to Cavell with aggression, hoping to take claim of what didn't belong to them. The village Calbraun called home had no name, but it had a large population. Calbraun often thought that it must have been a town at one point, but years of war between the noble houses of Cavell left it in ruins, only to be inhabited by desperate families far too poor to live anywhere else. It sat inside the territory of Cavell near the Black Sea, near the human garrison of Dawnmire. The village was by the border of the Free Territory, Rakarn, which lied to the south. Cavell was well known for its farming and high population of humans. For an elf, the presence of humans may have been uncomfortable, but Calbraun had been sick of his own kind. Humans looked up to elves because of their experience in hunting, warfare, and even farming. The forests of Cavell were dense and thick. In certain areas you could go into the forest and it looked like the night had fallen over you. The trees were covered in an auburn color because of the red maples that covered the landscape. Most of West Cavell was farms and villages, just like the small one Calbraun called home. The empire of Cavell was weeks to the north, in the ancient city of Imunran. The villagers, however, had no money to pay the taxes required to live there, so instead of handing out coin for the protection of the Cavell Empire, they lived in the free world, exposed and vulnerable to the outside elements of the land. As Calbraun suspected, he could see the beginning of his village just before the sun was setting in the west. When he got close enough, he saw villagers hovering around their huts and taverns. Chimneys exhaled smoke from the fires blazing inside the homes. The winter years were coming and the farming would cease because of the change in weather. Villages such as this saw races come together. They were outcasts, much like Calbraun was. In earlier days, the elves usually stuck to their own. But most recently, clans who were part of the war going on in the Winterlands joined up with a leader who was trying to make an empire of elves far to the northeast. Deals and treaties were struck. promising title, land, and power to those who agreed to fight under the command of this leader. In recent years, elves from several known tribes left their people when they joined because they believed in the old ways. They would rather settle with humans than have to join with a rival clan. They wouldn't have a king rule over them and thought an empire of elves would be surrounded by politics and corruption, much like the history of the human empires. Just as Calbraun came in from the west path toward the village, he could see the farmers returning from the great fields, gathering as many crops as the land would allow. The cold weather was killing the land, and soon no crops would grow. Men, women, and children surrounded braziers outside their huts and talked with their friends and neighbors. The daily hunts were over. When he got closer to the village, hunters who had left the same time in the morning as he were returning to their homes without a catch, their families waiting impatiently to see if they would eat for the night. He witnessed the sadness in their faces as those hunters with no kill told their wives and children the news. A sickening twist came to his stomach. The animals declined because of the season, and all that could be spared was the decreasing crops growing on near barren land. The villagers knew they needed to move out to other areas of the world to fend for food and better shelter with the coming winter. The sun set behind the crowds of hunters that came back toward the village. Darkness in these parts was frightening, and evils dwelled once the sun was down. Villagers built fires and stayed close to their neighbors so they couldn't get taken by the mysterious beasts and animals that stalked the forest at night. The strange noises that came from the darkness were haunting. When the howls came, everyone would scatter inside their homes for safety. Calbraun never feared what the dark had to offer. He had seen many other things among the world that were truly fearful. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions were nothing compared to the evils that dwelled beyond the quiet of the village. Crowds of hunters gathered near the entrance of the village. He could hear them complaining to one another about coming back empty-handed. Here he was, covered in the blood of 4 deer, and his fellow neighbors were without anything. Soon, the eyes of his fellow villagers pierced in his direction, in awe of what he was returning with. He kept his mind to returning to his hut, never returning their glances in fear that even with a stone face, they would misinterpret it as boastful or arrogant. He already knew he was going to share what he caught. 4 deer would feed him and his sons for the next few weeks once it was all cooked and stored, but it would only be right if he handed it to his neighbors so they didn't have to starve. Clorin strained from pushing the cart of deer. The wheels squeaked with every turn. Hecarus climbed on top of it and looked at Clorin while he pushed. "Come on, Clorin, you can do better than that. It's hard enough to push this thing with 4 deer on it, but with you on it, it's near impossible," Clorin complained. "Hecarus," Calbraun called with purpose. His middle son looked to him in fear. All Calbraun needed was a tone a little higher than normal. "Get off there at once and stop teasing your brother." Hecarus jumped off after hearing the boiling anger in his father's tone. If he didn't listen to him in the past when he raised his voice in this matter, it usually ended with him getting whipped. "Calbraun," a fellow hunter called to the old elf. Calbraun looked over at a human farmer who didn't have a catch for the day. His clothes were torn and his entire body looked dirty from his many hours of travel through the brush and landscape of the forest. The terrain was no help to him, and coming back empty-handed meant his family would have to starve for another night. "How many?" Calbraun nearly looked down in shame. "4. "Praise word, and how did you manage that?" the human farmer asked. "There are so few even in these parts." "I had to travel far," Calbraun stressed. "If I went any further south, I would have been in Rakarn." Calbraun could see the hunter eyeing his catch. The old elf could almost hear the grumble in his stomach while he looked at a few pieces of butchered meat. Calbraun grabbed some chops, and without needing to ask, the hunter received a meal for him and his family for the night. "May the gods look after you and your family," the starved hunter said, taking them from the outstretched hand of Calbraun. Calbraun slightly bowed his head. "Enjoy the meal. Go further south tomorrow. You may be able to find a few for yourself." The old elf saw more villagers as he returned home. A gentle nod or even a small greeting toward some. Some of the others managed to get a catch, but the decline in food was starting to show with each new dawn that came. Months earlier, even the clumsiest hunter would get lucky, but the coming winter was forcing the herds to move. Now, even Calbraun had to admit to himself that 4 was a gift from the gods. "They must know I look out for the less fortunate. Perhaps they know I will take care of my neighbors." Calbraun was always greeted by nearly every farmer of his village. Rumors of his skills in the battlefield were spread around the land far before he settled there. He heard the whispers. They came whenever he walked by others he lived with. He never bragged about what he was capable of, nor would he engage in a conversation with a fellow farmer who asked him about it. His past was behind him. He wanted it to stay there if he could help it. It had been a long time since he raised his sword in battle with another mortal, and that began to comfort him. Calbraun's eyes drifted toward Halus, still looking down, no doubt because of the deer. His eyes slowly came up when he heard voices, and he noticed another farmer's family as they walked by the huts. There was an elf family much like his with many children. One of them, a girl about Halus's age, looked at Calbraun's son just when he walked by. She was wearing a ripped-up white dress and her blonde hair was tied back. She had cornflower blue eyes that gazed at the boy. Calbraun could see the look on his son's face and knew he was enchanted. Halus had a shocked look while he stared, and the small girl just smiled at him gently. That's it. Calbraun could almost remember the first time he had that same look when a girl stared at him. He won't be playing with the other children much longer. He'll be chasing girls. The old elf smirked for a moment. Halus looked a lot like him, but there was that hidden expression every once in a while like his mother, Saritha. The smirk left Calbraun's face quickly when he thought about her again. The pain was still fresh when he thought about her. Time heals all wounds. A saying the humans had, but Calbraun always thought that time only made you forget pain, until it was revived again. Hecarus saw the exchange between Halus and the young girl and quickly hit his younger brother in the shoulder playfully. Halus turned and gasped, rubbing his shoulder before he hit back. Hecarus looked like he was about to retaliate, but Calbraun grabbed him by the back of his shirt and pulled him away. Calbraun placed himself in the middle of them to make sure they didn't fool around anymore. "You two start that up and I'll whip you," Calbraun warned. "We were only playing, father," Hecarus assured. "Playing or not, you will not act that way," Calbraun grumbled. This tone was a little harsher than the first time he had to raise his voice. The thoughts of Saritha still stirred in his mind. He hated himself for speaking to them this way, but they only thought it was out of discipline. He knew they didn't realize the loss of their mother still ate at him, like a raven plucking at the bones of a corpse. The loss of Clorin's mother was a little easier, as easy as death can be on a man who loses his wife. She died while giving birth to Clorin. It happened quite often in the days when Calbraun was part of his first tribe. Many of the maidens and servants didn't know how to handle childbirth, but he always thought it's what the gods wanted. A life for a life in a way. Worden was the god of life, and if he decided to take a woman in childbirth, it was to be respected. Calbraun could live with that death, it was common. The way Saritha died, however, he could never accept. Calbraun watched Halus turn his head and look back at the little girl again. She was still looking over at him. He returned her stare, almost tripping over the high brush in the village. "Watch your step, boy," Calbraun said to him. He lowered his tone this time, making it as gentle as an apology. The boy was still looking back, and Calbraun grabbed his son's head gently and turned it forward. "That's trouble, Halus. Stay clear of it." Calbraun and his sons all stopped at their hut in the center of the village. It wasn't much, just enough room for the four of them and a fireplace to cook whatever meal Calbraun was lucky enough to get. Like all the others, it was made from mud, sod, turf, and scrap timber. It was a narrow rectangular shape, roofed with tree branches and straw. The floor was mud scattered with hay. The old elf was surprised to find a stranger awaiting them. In all the times he returned from the forest, he never had a visitor, even from his neighbors. He may have been very giving toward them, but he made it very clear that he didn't wish to be bothered when he was at his home. He stayed to himself, skinned his furs, made his meat chops, raised his sons, and every occupant of the village knew he wanted his privacy. Even then, he could feel the eyes of his neighbors lingering while the warrior stood there. The slender elf was covered in heavy armor. He wore black woolen pants and black leather gloves with a blue cloak over his shoulders. The horned war helm he wore covered his head, but his face could still be seen. His pointed elf ears sprouted out of the side of the helm. A blue dragon was crested in the center of his clean armor, and the remaining parts of his clothing didn't have a spot of dirt on them. After a long glance toward one another, the warrior greeted Calbraun with a smirk. Calbraun could see the look of amazement on his sons' faces when they saw the stranger. His attire was that of a proper warrior, one they heard stories about from the travelers who passed through. The fabric in which his cape and undershirt were made from was far too glamorous for an elf in these parts. Calbraun wasn't happy at all to see him. He laughed under his breath as he studied the warrior. He wasn't impressed with the exotic fabric or the untouched plated armor. With his eyes glaring at the warrior, Calbraun commanded his eldest son, "Take 3 of the deer to where the vendors are and give it to the others. The first one we will keep for ourselves." "But father, we caught them all," Clorin reminded. Calbraun's head snapped toward Clorin. "Do as I say, boy. There are some here not as privileged as we are." Clorin dropped his shoulders because of Calbraun's tone. He finally nodded, quickly taking the first deer and tossing it on a table outside the small hut. Clorin picked up the handles of the cart and pushed beyond their home. The two youngest boys stayed next to their father, still unaware of who the stranger was or what he wanted. "You two, inside," Calbraun said as he saw his youngest boys staring at the mysterious elf. They went in quickly, but Calbraun knew they weren't going to just stay inside and sit there. He heard their footsteps as they headed to the window. They were going to spy on him, like the two of them always did whenever he was outside. The old elf could hear them breathing. Calbraun looked the warrior over. "Dalian, I see you wear the mark of the Raladoras." "Royal elves," Dalian said. Calbraun looked at him queerly. The name sounded rather odd. "Tamian is calling his followers royal elves now. Interesting name." Calbraun placed his sword down and leaned it against the hut. "And what are the tribes to the north calling themselves?" "They go by their tribal name," Dalian said. "The Drackle." "Any word?" He could see the defeat in Dalian's eyes. "It isn't going well, if I must be honest. That's why I'm here. He is looking for the best warriors in all the land. We are keeping them back, but not by much. They are coming further south as we speak. From what the scouts have told us, they are calling it the Purge." "The Purge?" he asked in false misunderstanding. "They look to purify the world of all elves who are not Drackle. The latest clan to feel their wrath was the Frolins. 10,000 killed overnight. The women, the children, none were spared." Calbraun ignored the chill in his spine when he heard that. "Who leads them?" "A warrior named Asdar," Dalian said. "I've heard rumors about him." "What kind?" "He is gifted in the darkness." Calbraun nodded slowly. "I heard the same." Dalian swallowed in worry. "They say he is in league with him." "Him? You know who I speak of," the warrior said. "The Lord of Darkness." Calbraun bit his lower lip and continued to play ignorant. "You shouldn't believe rumors." I wish I could tell him the truth. The warrior exhaled loudly as if it was a removal of a large weight from his shoulders. He searched the village with his eyes and crossed his arms. "It's odd for me to be here. I remember when we first met. Do you?" Calbraun held back a grin. "I was a wandering warrior with a young son." Dalian grunted contentedly. "Clorin doesn't look like he's aged at all. You still teaching him the sword?" "Of course. He should be a seasoned warrior by now," Dalian said. "Instead, you kept him away from war and battles, sent him to that sanctuary for most of his life, even when you were a lichen." "I want him to know peace, not war," Calbraun said. Dalian's eyes met the neighbors who looked to be curious about his presence. "You claimed to be in trouble then, begged for help for you and your son. I came through for you. I may need you now." "You will hold that against me?" Calbraun asked. Dalian leaned himself against Calbraun's hut, eyes still looking to the farmers and commoners around them. "I see you still find comfort being in the presence of humans and outcasts. After you left the Lycans, it was rumored that you were with the Lucians." Calbraun faced the deer that remained for him and his family. "No, I traveled away from the clans. For the first few years I settled with allies I had gained when I used to lead the Lycans, but their elders thought it was best to join with the Raladoras when rumors were spreading about uniting the clans." "And why didn't you join?" Dalian asked. Calbraun just glared at him. Dalian grunted. "Because of what happened with Tamian all those years ago? That conflict is long gone." Calbraun's dagger went into the deer, starting to remove the fur so he could get to the flesh and make chops. "Tell that to the hundreds of Lycans he killed when he was looking for me." Calbraun looked from the deer to Dalian. "And what about your clan? Did they decide to join?" "No," Dalian said softly. "A warrior named Driffinthel came with a peace offering. He told us what the plans were of the Raladoras and asked if we'd like to join. The elders of my clan said if some of us wanted, we could leave and join in the conflict." "What did Tamian offer?" "Land, title, and power once the empire is raised." Calbraun stopped skinning the deer and placed his knife down. "You broke your vows to your clan for what could possibly be a false promise?" "It's not false," Dalian assured. "He's gathered some of the greatest elves in all the continent. The blacksmiths of the eastern tribes who learned their craft from the dwarfs, the master archers of the Krasian clan, and so many more. I know someone like you will be welcomed with what you have to offer. A warrior like you will be considered a noble. Is that so?" The blood from his catch poured onto the table that was filled with dry blood and deer guts from previous occasions. Furs that Calbraun removed days earlier were still drying out. He may have been able to get a decent amount of coin for them, but as usual, he couldn't help but take care of his fellow villagers. He could still feel Dalian's eyes on him while he worked. And who is it that says who is of noble blood and common? The same mortal who will call himself king once his great city is built once he wins this war. It will be built, Dalian assured. Every clan to the east of here has joined and there are more to come. A warrior like you is a noble because of your legend and skills in the battlefield. You led the Lycans, everyone knows that. I only fight to protect my family now, Calbraun said, as well as the less fortunate. Who will protect the humans and halflings in these parts? This village is my home now and home to my children. Dalian nodded in understanding. I know you haven't been the same since she died. Do not bring that up, Calbraun warned, pointing his knife at Dalian. It was harsh enough that he thought of her as he came in from the forests, but now Dalian mentioned her and it opened the wound further. At least he didn't say her name. As odd as it sounded when her name wasn't mentioned, he could almost think of her as someone else. I'm sorry. I heard the rumor after it happened. Dalian knew he crossed a line. You should take your children and come with me. He changed the subject quickly. You will be a great voice in the Empire. Calbraun stood up straight, the blood pouring across the table and dripping to the ground. Let's just say he is sincere. Let's say Tamian does want me to join without harming me. He must be extremely desperate if he is willing to make peace with an enemy such as I. The bodies that he left of my people weren't done with honor. Women were raped, children were burned, and the warriors were removed of all their limbs. That makes me question why he would even think I would put that aside. That means the rumors are far worse than what you're actually telling me. Calbraun stabbed his knife into the table and started to clean his hands with a cloth. He thought this was going to be easy. His damn father telling him he would be a prince and one day king. He fell in love with his own legend far before he even had one. He thinks that I'm so scared of him that I'll bend the knee and ask for forgiveness for what he did to my people. Dalian swallowed with worry. He took slow steps toward Calbraun and whispered, Things must be put in the past, Calbraun, especially now. You have no idea what has been going on. You have no idea how many have been buried and how many more will wait for the boatmen. This is something I've never seen before, and if they are not stopped, they will turn this land to fire and nothing will survive. Please put old grudges to the side for now even. If you don't, there will be none of us left. Dalian's face completely changed to horror, like he was reliving what he experienced in the Winterlands. The words were on Calbraun's tongue and ready to answer, but he felt a cold chill in the air. The sensation made him turn slightly toward the forest just off in the distance. There was something that an experienced warrior like him had felt many times in the past. The air went silent even with the voices of villagers around him. A tension fell over him and he knew what was coming. An army. Calbraun, Dalian called, noticing his reserve. What is it? Calbraun didn't say a word as he reached for his sword. Dalian pulled his blade too and his eyes looked to the forest in the distance. Calbraun looked to the huts beside his and yelled, Take the children east. The villagers looked at him with befuddled expressions. At first they just stared over at him, not understanding the sudden outburst. Get the children out of here. Calbraun yelled again to the villagers. Warn the others at once. The second time he said it, the villagers could see the conviction in his eyes and the worry in his tone. He heard them scattering about, the noise of movement spreading to the huts even beyond where he was. Something wrong, Calbraun? A human asked as he walked up. The human held a small hatchet. His wool clothing wouldn't be much protection, but it was his duty to fight for their village if the time came. Calbraun ignored the human, but not on purpose. The fields in the west had eyes. Calbraun was zoned out and glared toward them, his eyes narrowing. The old elf looked at them intensely with the instincts of a seasoned combatant. The farmers caused a bit of havoc when they scattered, falling over brush and small chairs that were around their homes while heading east. The sounds of the village went from quiet to carnage, and despite the high sounds, Calbraun didn't hear anything around him. He blocked out everything to try and get a clear sense of what he felt. Hecarus and Halus, Calbraun called in the middle of his trance. He could hear their feet tremble from the window toward the front door. He felt their eyes peer out of the hut. Find your brother. After you do, head north to the mountains. They didn't have a reply. All he heard were their feet dashing away. They had been taught the proper plan in times such as this. He had made them practice it in the event of an attack. Don't let this be an attack.